Welcome back to History 1302. Today we are going to continue and finish our lecture on World War I. Today's focus for the lecture is going to be on the American reaction to, the beginning of the war. So we're going to talk about its stance on neutrality. We'll also discuss, the reasons why the U.S. decided to enter the war in 1917. And how the war affected Americans both at home and abroad, before finally finishing off with the Treaty of Versailles and its consequences. Okay, so to recap, on the last lecture, we basically talked about there is a lot of, background story there, right? A lot of history that goes back, hundreds of years between France and England and Germany and Russia and Germany and France. And of course, one of the problems of this modern period is nationalism. And as we'll see today, President Woodrow Wilson is going to echo some of those sentiments that Serbian nationalists were demanding, essentially, is to have self-determination and autonomy from foreign governments and foreign powers. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. Don't forget, we've got these long-term causes, right? Nationalism, imperialism, militarism, and then, of course, the secret alliances, which is the reason why it became this, pile-on, and in essence, a world conflict rather than a war between, Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, the spark, of course, being the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who is the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And when he is assassinated, this is what triggers Austria to declare war on Serbia, and then the alliances are triggered after that. Okay? Now, when it comes to the United States wanted to be neutral. They wanted to be out of the war. They wanted to stay out of it completely. But they also wanted to, sell war materials to each of the combatants, each of the countries that are involved here. Now, the United States is very committed to isolationism, but that's going to change, especially when U.S. ships are being stopped by both British and German, boats. And this is a problem for the United States, and especially for Wilson, because they believe that they have, freedom of the seas, freedom to continue engaging in commerce. And remember, the U.S. is trying to stay neutral, but they see no problem in profiting from the war, right, and helping its own economy. That's essentially what brings them into the war. But it doesn't happen in 1914 or 1915 or 1916. It doesn't happen until 1917. Okay? So, Great Britain, they have the best navy at the time. The Germans had been the enemy of Great Britain for a very long time. So, in order to be competitive, they basically create these U-boats, right? These submarines, Unterseeboots. And they use them to sink ships that are carrying supplies to Great Britain. Now, British needs those supplies to continue fighting, right? And they need the money, and they need all of these things that they're going to get from the United States. And one of the tactics that they come up with is essentially smuggling weapons on board these passenger ships. And that's where they get into trouble, okay? Now, the Lusitania is a British passenger ship, right? A lot of people look at the sinking of the Lusitania and they go, that's it. That's the reason why the United States went into war. And that's simply not true, because it doesn't happen as a direct consequence of the sinking of the Lusitania. The Lusitania goes down in 1915, okay? The U.S. doesn't go into war until 1917. So please, nobody tell me on the test that the Lusitania was the reason why the U.S. went to war. That's not correct, okay? It is indirectly connected to it, but it doesn't happen like, oh, they sank the Lusitania, so the result is the U.S. goes into the war. That's not quite how it happens, okay? There's still 2 years from the U.S. finally joining the war effort. However, there is a lot of outrage over it because it is a passenger ship. It was, carrying civilians, and there are 128 Americans on board that are going to lose their life in the sinking of the Lusitania. So again, this takes place on May 7th, 1915. These German U-boats, they spot the Lusitania, and they're really good at what they do. And so when they spot it, it's like a big fish, right? They want to catch it. They do. And there's a lot of backstories to this as well, with the Lusitania. Why didn't it have, what do you call it? Like, oh my gosh, it's like a convoy in front of it. Oh my gosh, I don't know what to call it. Like a guide, to protect it. And they were really trying to get out of there as soon as possible. And they were going like full speed, right? Which would have outrun any kind of U-boats that could have been in the area. But as they were getting closer and closer to shore, they end up to the English Channel. They ended up encountering fog, which meant that they had to slow down and made them an easy target for these German U-boats that spotted it. Okay, so in total, nearly 1,200 people lose their life, and it's very sad because they were close enough. They were about 8 miles out from the shore, so they were close enough where they could see, land ahead, but much too far to actually try to swim in that frigid, icy water, and like I said, civilians lost their lives, women, children, men, regular people. But on board that ship, 128 Americans also died. And this creates a lot of resentment. Americans are upset. Wilson is upset. It creates a lot of anti-German sentiment as well in the United States, but it doesn't lead us directly into war. Okay, it starts the process. At the time, there was a lot of German Americans living in the United States, and people were kind of divided on the issue. We don't really want to get involved. It seems like something that's going on, on the other side of the world. Americans want to preserve their neutrality, their isolationism, but the Lusitania starts to break away at that. Okay, now Wilson, of course, is very upset with the whole thing. He wants the Germans to essentially, pay reparations, do something to stop the needless loss of life here of civilians. And for the Germans' defense, I guess you could say, they had been trying to warn everybody, Americans especially. You can see here this advertisement that they had put out in American newspapers, warning people, travelers especially, to be careful because there's a war going on, and you don't want to be involved or on board a ship that may be smuggling weapons to our enemy, because we will torpedo it. And that's essentially what happened here, right? They were warning people not to risk their lives. And, Germany really looks like the bad guy here, because the United States wants them to pay for what they've done. They want them to make, pay reparations, make concessions. And so the U.S. is going to force Germany to essentially take a stance and make a pledge. Wilson is demanding that the Germans not only apologize, but that they also promise not to sink any more passenger ships without any kind of warning, right? And so this is one of the tactics that the Germans were using. It's called unrestricted submarine warfare, where essentially if they see an enemy ship, or they perceive, that there's an enemy ship close by, they are going to torpedo it, right? They're going to sink it. Now, if Germany goes on ahead with, meeting Wilson's demands, they're going to have a problem, because, well, let me explain to you what Wilson wants, okay? Wilson wants Germany to take the Sussex Pledge, okay? The Sussex Pledge is basically Germany saying we will not sink any more ships indiscriminately or without warning, okay? And so when we look at Germany's dilemma here, right, on the one side, right, on this side over here, right, if they take the Sussex Pledge, if they do what Wilson says, it keeps the U.S. happy, it keeps the U.S. out of the war, but the bad part is it's going to allow for supplies to continue getting to the enemy, which in essence is going to make it harder for Germany to win the war. Okay, so that's one side. On the other side, right over here, if they don't take the pledge and they continue unrestricted submarine warfare, this gives them an advantage, right? Because they're very good at this. They're stopping supplies from getting there. They're sinking their ships. So that's a good thing for Germany. However, if they don't do what Wilson says and they don't take the Sussex Pledge, this is going to anger the United States, meaning the United States will join the war, and then Germany would have another country to fight, thus making it harder for Germany to win the war. So no matter how you look at it, it's a lose-lose for Germany. So what does Germany do? In the end, do they take the pledge or don't they? Well, they do. Okay, they take the pledge. So like I said, Germany looks very bad at this time. There's a lot of anti-German propaganda. The people are starting to turn against them, especially in the United States. And so there's a lot of pressure on them to stop what they're doing, but this puts them at a disadvantage because remember, the war is essentially in a stalemate. Yeah, that's it. The war is essentially in a stalemate, and Germany needs to come up with a new way to, end this war once and for all. Okay, so now that we've established that after the sinking of the Lusitania, Germany is going to go ahead and make a pledge to the United States and the world that they will no longer be sinking ships indiscriminately. Okay? But the problem with this is that after 2 years of, withholding their torpedoes, withholding those submarine attacks, which proved to be a huge advantage for Germany, the war is really not going to progress anymore. And from 1915 to 1917, right, for 2 years after the sinking of the Lusitania, and for 2 years after Germany made the Sussex Pledge, the war continues in a stalemate. So, in 1917, and listen up because this is one of the reasons why the United States will enter the war in 1917. Germany announces that they will continue unrestricted submarine warfare. What that means is that they are basically announcing, they are telling the world that their U-boats will sink any ships, even neutrals, that go through this territory. Okay? So remember, they sank the Lusitania in 1915. Americans are upset. They want some kind of reparations. They want Germany to make promises that they will not do this for all of the reasons that, the United States believed that they had freedom of the seas, freedom of trade, all of that. And Germany ended up taking that pledge, right? Because, right, if they did that, it would keep the United States out of the war, right? They wouldn't have to worry about fighting them again. But by 1917, 2 years after that, the war is in a stalemate. Neither side is winning. Germany has to do something to end this war once and for all. And so they announce that they are going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, which is one of the reasons why it's going to push the United States closer to war. Okay? The Lusitania itself does not cause the United States to join the war. But 2 years after that, when Germany announces that they're going to continue that same kind of activity, that is what pushes the Americans closer towards war. But no declaration of war just yet. Okay? That comes after the Zimmermann Note. Okay, so the Zimmermann Note, right? This is by, it's a coded telegram that was written by Arthur Zimmermann, who is the equivalent of the Secretary of State, right? He's a chief diplomat for Germany. Now he's going to send a telegram to Germany, to the German ambassador, in Mexico City, where he's essentially telling him to approach the Mexican government with a deal. In the event that the United States declares war on Germany, if Mexico promises to attack the United States, then when they win, right? When and if they win, then Mexico will be rewarded by getting back all of its lost provinces, right? That they lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War. And that is a huge chunk of land, right? All those lost territories. Now, the invasion here would be much more immediate threat for the United States, and it would be a great distraction, hopefully, in Germany's eyes, preventing the United States from going to fight in Europe, right? Instead, staying here, being distracted with having to fight Mexico. And, when this letter was intercepted by British intelligence, they went to Woodrow Wilson with it. They told him what the Germans were up to. And, Wilson's upset about it, but he doesn't want to declare war, right? I mean, remember, the United States is committed to isolationism. But this letter is made public once it's decoded. It is made public, and newspapers all over the country are going to run with this story, and it's going to put a lot of pressure on the administration, on the government to do something. And quite frankly, it creates a lot of anguish and fear and anxiety and anger, because although the United States had been trying to stay isolated, out of this conflict, the fact of the matter is that the fear that Mexico could attack was great. It was no longer like a war that's going on halfway around the world. It was like, oh my God, the war is coming to us, and our southern border is vulnerable. Right? Now, what is interesting about the Zimmermann Note is the probability that Mexico could have attacked is unlikely. At the time, Mexico is actually going through their Porfiriato, right? The Mexican Revolution started in 1910. And the reality is that the chances were pretty slim that Mexico would have actually done any of this had they been approached by the Germans. But here's where it gets interesting. The reality is not as important as the perception, because at this time, Pancho Villa had invaded the United States in 1914, and then, all the way through 1916. So the American people, actually thought that Mexico could invade. And what could be worse than, thousands of Pancho Villas coming across the border and attacking, innocent Americans? So, again, not likely to happen, but the perception was real. And so this is the reason why Woodrow Wilson is going to eventually go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war on April 2nd, 1917 against the Germans, okay? So, April 2nd, 1917, President Wilson asks Congress for a declaration of war. Why is this important? Why doesn't President Wilson just declare war, right? Well, because he can't. He doesn't have that power, right? The Constitution clearly says that only Congress can declare war, right? So the president basically has to make a case. He has to argue why the United States should go to war. And remember, we're talking about doing a huge 180, right? Completely turning our back on isolationism, right? A foreign policy that has done the United States extremely well, And how do you get the American people to see that there is just cause in invading or fighting somewhere else? He's got a monumental task ahead of him. But he is going to come up with a pretty good argument, because what he says in his speech, and it's a very long, very eloquent, very eloquent speech, where he basically argues, among other things, that, our war is not with the German people, right? It is with the Kaiser, because essentially the Kaiser ordered these people to fight, whereas they had no say. Remember those pictures I showed you of those suffragettes that were outside of the White House calling President Wilson Kaiser Wilson? Yeah, that's what they were talking about, calling him a hypocrite. But he also talks about how, Russia is quote unquote democratic at heart. Okay. And not only that, but he also says that, if we do nothing and Germany wins, then democracy could possibly end for our allies in Britain, in France. And not only that, but if nobody stops Germany, right? If we do nothing, then essentially democracy would be at stake for the entire world. And so he goes on to say that the world must be made safe for democracy, right? Remember, he has to make the United States go to war. He has to convince the American people that there is a reason why we must leave behind decades of isolationism. And so he's got to commit them to this, right? To this idea, right? Something that is beyond, greater, bigger than any of us. And what's a better reason to fight than for democracy? And like I told you before, when I showed you that little clip, the little video of, the United States at war, if you look back at all of the conflicts that the United States has been involved with or in ever since World War One, you look at World War Two, why did we go fight? Well, because the world must be made safe for democracy against fascism. In the Cold War, the world must be made safe against communism. Vietnam, same thing, and everywhere that the United States is involved, we're there for democracy. And our American military men and women are there defending our democratic ideals. And so, in terms of what is the long-term consequence of this new philosophy, well, it's going to shape American foreign policy for, up until today. It continues to shape it, right? And it's the reason why we are anywhere and everywhere in the world. Okay, so you got to give Wilson props for this one. He convinces the American public that we must go forward, that we must do something. And, the American people are jumping to support this. Okay, men and women, everyone. Okay, so let's talk about the United States at war, but let's focus on the home front first. Part of the question that you have to kind of pause and ponder here is, how is it that a nation is able to mobilize, millions of people and an entire economy for the war effort? And the answer to that question lies in the changes that took place during the progressive era. So if you remember when we were lecturing on the progressives, part of what they wanted to achieve was for the government to move away from laissez-faire politics. And that meant that, they wanted the government to be more involved. They wanted, the government to address social problems, problems within the economy, problems, with wages and labor. And that was difficult in and of itself, because remember that the government had been really kind of operating on this laissez-faire policy, where it was basically hands off, right? Like no regulation. It really didn't deal with social issues or anything like that. But the progressives made sure that, the government was addressing the multitude of social problems that stemmed from, the changes due to industrialism, urbanization, all of that stuff, okay? So essentially what I'm trying to say here is that the mechanism was already in place. And so when it came time to mobilize the nation, they already had the capacity to do that, simply because there was many more agencies, the government, the scope and the reach of the government was much more broad in that. And so, there are a couple of agencies that I want to discuss before we get into the actual fighting. For example, the Council of National Defense is essentially, a group of advisors to the President of the United States. They're going to advise them on everything from the economy to, developing machinery and guns and ammunitions and things like that. And so they're going to be a special counsel to him. But we also have, the War Industries Board, the Food Administration, and the Fuel Administration, which are going to be essential in coordinating between the different industries and the businesses and the farmers and the factories to make sure that there's enough food, for example, to feed not only, the American people, but also feed the Allies, where much of the French countryside, for example, had been torn up and destroyed, and, they couldn't grow their own food. So the United States is going to step in and do that. And one of the ways that they're able to achieve that is by issuing rationing coupons. Rationing works because, it ensures that everybody has their fair share. So if you think of what happened recently with the pandemic and stuff like that, everybody went crazy. The lines were insane to get into the grocery store. People started hoarding toilet paper. In order to avoid that from happening, not the War Industries Board, but the Food Administration would be coming in and making sure that, everybody has enough. Right now, this works in conjunction with rationing, right? So making sure that a large majority of, the chocolate, the sugar, the butter, the bacon, all of the good stuff goes to the troops first, and then everybody else is supposed to, save what they have, not be wasteful. They're encouraged to, plant their own veggie gardens and that sort of thing. And so they become a very important part of the mobilization at home. The Fuel Administration is going to do the same thing. So there's this big effort to conserve, to not be wasteful, making sure that the troops and our allies have enough, fuel. They do this for gasoline and kerosene as well. And, they also remind people to conserve and walk, when they can. And one of the major components here, to ensure that people are aware of this is the Committees on Public Information, also known as the Creole Committee. Now, the Creole Committee, you've seen it. You're familiar with it, even if you don't know it already. But Uncle Sam is one of the biggest icons, right, of the time. And so, they're essentially going around and letting people know what they can do to contribute. And everybody can do that. Men, women, children, everybody can contribute. There's a little bit of effort, and it goes a big way. Now, the other thing I want you to consider, too, is that, this is during a time when there's, no mass media, not like there is today, no internet, right? So, essentially, there's, 75,000 men, right, who are speakers. And they're going around the country and, they prepare these little like 4-minute speeches. They're called the 4-minute men. It's a reference to the fact that they speak for 4 minutes, but it also has this symbolic, sort of like throwback meaning to the Minutemen, right? The guys from the American Revolution who were, citizen military that would pick up their gun and fight for democracy. So in essence, they're going around educating the public, letting them know what they can do. And they really have a huge impact as well, right? There's this really big effort to make people believe in the war. Because remember, just in April 1917, the United States had basically done a 180 on isolationism. And so now they have to go around the country and essentially like convince everybody that this is an American thing and this is about democracy and that everybody has to do their part. And the people really buy into it. One of the other problems, one of the problems that the nation is also going to be faced with is the fact that, there's a lot of hyphenated Americans. There's like English Americans and like Mexican Americans, German Americans, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, you name it. But during this wartime, there's a big sort of push. They want to push this narrative that, we're all in this together and we're all 100% American. And so this goes sort of hand in hand with the idea that, people in the United States are very aware of the fact that, loyalty might be a problem. And so they want to go ahead and protect the nation's interests. They want to protect or put forward, the war effort primarily. And one of the laws that the government is going to pass is, going to deal with that loyalty issue. And it's known as the Espionage and Sedition Act of 1918. And it was designed to make it easier to deport anybody that was thought of possibly being a spy or, working against the nation's interests. But it also was created to stop people from speaking out against the United States, right? So any kind of seditious speech. Now, this is where it gets interesting, because there is a case, the trial of a woman by the name of Kate Richards O'Hare. Now, Kate Richards O'Hare, was a socialist, and she supported people who were interested in fixing working conditions during the progressive era. She really fought for, getting the government to step up and use their power to fix those problems. But during World War I, she's going to be put on trial for violating this law, the Espionage and Sedition Act, because she was essentially going around and giving these speeches, kind of like in a town hall setting. And she's targeting American mothers. She's basically trying to convince them that, not to send their sons to go to war, that they were not fighting for democracy, that in fact, they were instead fighting Morgan's war. She was basically saying that this was about business. Now, what was she going on about? And who's Morgan? Well, remember, we've really only spoken about one Morgan this semester, and that's J.P. Morgan. What she was alluding to is the fact that there were a lot of companies that were profiting off of the war effort. She was basically saying that, there's these companies that are making obscene amounts of money. They're profiting from the war, and they're using these, regular guys, these young men who are making the ultimate sacrifice, believing that they're fighting for something, awesome like democracy, when in fact, it's only enlarging the pockets of these businesses. I mean, she even goes as far as telling these mothers that, if they let their kids go off to fight in this war, that they're essentially going to come back as fertilizer. Okay. So she's using very strong language and imagery, and it's quite powerful to the point where the government basically looks at her as a threat. Okay. Because according to the law, she was killing the American spirit and committing sedition. Right? She was illegally killing Americans, will to fight in this war. Now, I know this sounds kind of crazy, right? But, she believed that she was a real American because she was exercising her freedom of speech. And I know you're probably going like, well, wait a minute. Yeah, like, don't we have that constitutional right? And you do, except according to this law, not during wartime, right? So they're going to use this law against her. They're going to, charge her with this crime, with sedition. They're going to put her in jail. They're going to put her on trial, and she's going to be found guilty. All right. So, she's going to be sentenced to 5 years. And the interesting bit about all this is that, the government sees this woman as a threat to national security, a threat to national goals. She's committing sedition. But the weird thing is that essentially the judge lets her out early. She only serves 14 months because she was a lady. And so it's really kind of contradictory, right? It's like, here's this little lady that is, a threat to national security, a threat to our national goals, but she's a lady, so we're going to let her off easy. I mean, it really kind of helped her in the end because she ended up serving a lot less time, but it does kind of put things into perspective a little bit. Now, this issue, this law really, and the issue, whether a person has freedom of speech or not, still feels relatively modern to us because we still haven't quite agreed on what is an acceptable amount of dissent. And, we're still trying to figure that out. Okay, let's talk about what's happening in Russia because it's actually going to play a pretty important role in the way that Germany responds to that and how it accelerates the pace of the war, as well as, the number of casualties, the intensity of the fighting, and then also the strategy for Germany moving forward. Okay, so remember how we were talking about Russia at the beginning of this lecture, talking about how, they really lacked any kind of industrialism. They're a very big country, but they had a lot of problems. A huge peasant population. People are generally unhappy with the Tsar. And these problems are going to come, in 1917, they're going to rear their ugly head again, okay? Because by 1917, the war is really not going well for Russia. The people are starting to blame the Tsar, in part because the Tsar makes a decision to essentially lead the army, in part because, he wanted it to be something patriotic and that, the country would look at it and go, yeah, you know what, that guy's really leading us into battle. But unfortunately, a string of defeats are going to be associated with the Tsar. And it's just going to turn the people against him even more. So by March 1917, the tension is really starting to reach a high. People are really upset with the Tsar. And so March 1917, Tsar Nicholas II is going to abdicate the throne, which means that he is essentially going to give up power. Okay, now a new government is going to continue in the war, but by then the Germans are essentially going to make a deal with Vladimir Lenin to, send him back to Russia because he was starting to start he was attempting to start a Bolshevik revolution in Germany. But, they make a deal with him, they deliver him to Russia, where, he's going to lead the Bolshevik Party there, which leads to the Communist Revolution in November 1917. And it's really kind of interesting because, in Marx's Communist Manifesto, he talked about how, a communist revolution would come in an industrialized nation. And Russia was far from it, which is why Lenin was trying to incite that, in Germany. And it's really kind of interesting because although Marxism and communism can be pretty complex, it doesn't, make any sense that, peasants, uneducated peasants, would be able to understand about the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie and all this stuff, which is what communism is all about. But Lenin is able to communicate that struggle through, basically arguments, promises, where he's essentially promising peace, bread, right? Because they're hungry, they want peace, they want bread, and they want land. And even though Marxism and communism is a very complicated subject, peasants, right? These people that are unhappy with the Tsar, that wanted, change, they understand bread, peace, and land. And so Lenin and the Bolsheviks are going to end up taking control of the country, control of the government, and they will sign a peace with Germany, therefore knocking Russia out of the war. Okay, now the name of that treaty is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and it's signed in March 1918. The consequences of it is that Russia is out of the war. Okay, and with Russia out of the war, guess what else happens? Well, now Germany can focus on one front. Remember that they were split into two. Remember that's the whole plan, the premise behind the Schlieffen Plan, right, was to avoid a two-front war, knock out France first, and then go fight the Russians. But it didn't work out that way. But now it's 1918, right? It's been 4 years. And almost 4 years. And Russia is finally out of the war. They signed a peace negotiation with Germany, Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And now Germany can focus all of their forces, all of their effort on the Western Front. And this is why it's more important now than ever for Germany to make that, big push to be able to win this war once and for all, especially in trying to do this before the Americans join the fight. Okay, so remember, when does the United States declare war? The United States declares war in April 1917, right? March 1917, the Tsar abdicates, Lenin takes over, right? But the U.S. is still mobilizing. It takes time for the United States to mobilize and to be able to get the men trained and get them ready, at the front. And so Germany's hoping that with Russia out of the war, that they can now concentrate on the Western Front, fight a one-front war and end this war once and for all. Okay? So one of the impacts of the Communist Revolution in Russia is that, of course, there's a civil war for control that takes place there. The Tsar and his family are actually going to be arrested. This is after they abdicate. And they're going to be murdered as well. So I'm sorry, Disney. Disney got it right? Anastasia did not survive. They were all killed, even the dog and the maids and everybody. Okay. And Russia becomes the first communist nation in the world. So long impacts moving forward that, again, we're going to have to be dealing with later on, especially after World War II. Okay. So one of the main things about this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is that historians have looked at it and as an indicator of what would have happened if World War I would have been won by Germany. Okay, because they look at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk between Russia and Germany, and Russia actually made huge land concessions. All of this land right here, like they gave it up. They surrendered it to Germany. And so, historians have looked at that as an indication of what the treaty would have looked like after World War I had Germany won. Okay, so this is important. This is relevant because when we get to the Treaty of Versailles, we're going to talk about how unfair it was to Germany and this and that and all of the things that they made Germany do. But don't feel too bad for them, because if this Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is any indicator of what the Germans would have demanded had they won, they probably wouldn't have gone easy on anybody either. Okay, so nevertheless, let's get to the doughboys arriving to fight. Now, like I said, the United States are going to make a huge contribution to the war effort. They are going to be led right here by this guy, General John J. Pershing. He's going to be leading the American Expeditionary Force. And remember, this is like a coalition, right? You got the British, you got the French, you got the Americans, you got, the Russians are out at this point. And Pershing was somebody that he was adamant about not giving up any control over his boys to the British or to the French or anybody. Like, he was the only one, rightfully so, that was going to give orders to them. But that's a problem, right? Because you've got all of these different generals and you got different, coalitions, different militaries here. And it can be problematic. And there's this whole other side to the war that, we're not going to get a chance to discuss. But nevertheless, when they arrive, they are welcomed with cheers. The European people are sort of like optimistic that the war is finally going to come to an end. And they do sort of like re-energize the war. But anyways, that's what they call them, the doughboys, right? These American GIs. So, like I said before, Germany is going to make one last push, right? They've got one chance here to end this war once and for all. And they hope to do it now that Russia is out. They hope to do it before the Americans, join in and can make any kind of impact. So this spring offensive, it's what it's called. This is Germany's last chance. Now, the plan is March 1917, Germany is going to launch a major offensive on the Western Front, right? Remember, they're going to concentrate all of that troop movement, all of their forces on the Western Front. It is best said here by General Ludendorff, we must strike at the earliest moment before the Americans can throw strong forces into the scale. We must defeat the British. And so if you look at, battles of Verdun, the Battle of the Somme, they are throwing everything at it, in hopes to, defeat the French, defeat the British. And that has devastating consequences for all parties involved. But the idea here, with the spring offensive is to move these troops fast, to be able to push those Allied forces towards Paris, end the war once and for all. And so the pace here is moving very, very quickly. Like I said, casualties are going up, especially, and when you look at the beginning of the war and the end of the war, that's when you see, the highest number of casualties in the war. But anyway, so what happens with the spring offensive? It fails, okay? In part because German troops are tired, they are exhausted, they are running low on supplies. Remember that, mobilization, right? Like all of the logistics of moving an army are complicated. It's just as difficult to do than actually fighting a war. So what's going to end up with the spring offensive is the Allies are going to hold outside of Paris. Remember with the Schlieffen plan, that the object of the plan was to capture Paris, defeat the French, rush back to the Eastern Front. And it didn't work out, right? Because the British Expeditionary Force basically stopped the Germans from reaching Paris. And so they're going to stop. The fighting is going to start at the River Marne, right? Which is why at the beginning of the war, we have the first Battle of the Marne. Well, now it's 1918. And the plan is the same. Push towards Paris. But the Allies are going to hold the Germans back. They're not going to be able to reach Paris. They're going to get bogged down once again at the River Marne. And so we have the Second Battle of the Marne, right? Allies are going to counterattack here. They're going to begin to push the Germans back towards Germany. So back towards Belgium. And so I actually have some graphics here to show you, right? The idea here is to push back towards Paris, but they get stopped at the River Marne, where then the Allies are able to push them back towards Belgium. Okay, so the spring offensive totally fails. They are not able to drive the Allies towards Paris. They are not able to end the war, and the German, along with the Germans, but the Central Powers are essentially starting to collapse. So on October 30th, I have a little timeline here. The Ottoman Empire is going to sue for peace. That means they are waving the flag. They are out of the war. On November 3rd, Austria-Hungary is suing for peace, right? They're waving the flag. They are out. Interestingly enough, on November 7th, 1918, the German generals meet with the Allies to negotiate a ceasefire, right? So they're not surrendering. And this is an important thing to make a note of here, because the German generals do not surrender, right? Who does? Well, we'll see in a second. November 9th, right? So the generals meet on November 7th with the Allies to negotiate a ceasefire, which basically means like stop firing, right, on each other. It doesn't mean that the war is ended. It just means that they are no longer going to be shooting at one another. But on November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II is going to abdicate the throne. This is as a result of a lot of pressure also from, Wilson and the other allies. They just won't take no for an answer. So Kaiser Wilhelm II also vacates the throne, right? Abandons the throne, leaves for Holland, never returns, to Germany. And so again, we talk about what is Germany doing? Who's going to surrender for Germany, right? It's not the generals. It's not the Kaiser, because he abdicates. And so when the Kaiser leaves, who's going to run the country? Remember, we're talking about a monarchy, right? Where it's essentially an authoritarian government, where the Kaiser, the king, tells the German people, the government, what to do. But now he's gone. So the consequence of that is that a new German government is created, and they are now going to try to, end the war, do the arrangements for the treaty. And so this new democratic German government is going to agree to the armistice, is the one that is going to surrender, not the Kaiser, not the generals. And, that takes place on November 10th. So November 11th, 1918, at 11 a.m., both sides stop fighting. Celebrations break out around the world. And you can see some of that, those celebrations taking place here, right? It's almost like we've come full circle. Remember how at the beginning of the war, soldiers broke out, and not just soldiers, but like people were celebrating because they were finally going to get a chance to prove that their country was better than all the others. But now they're cheering for a different reason. It's been 4 very long, very tough years of fighting, and all parties involved have agreed to, end all fighting. But the war is not over, right? Because a treaty needs to be signed, and more importantly, it needs to be negotiated. And that's what we're going to talk about next. Okay, guys, now let's talk about Woodrow Wilson's plan for peace. It's really interesting how, according to Woodrow Wilson, how his 14-point speech, which he had delivered in January 1918, was the basis, at least in his mind, would become the basis for, achieving peace without victory, And so let me give you a little bit of background about this speech and what it was about and why is it called the 14 points. So basically, Woodrow Wilson is going to lay out to the American population and the world what he believes should be the basis for the end of the war. And in essence, it's these 14 points, right, that we got to do in order to prevent a war like this from happening again, in order to maintain peace, in order to protect democracy, and so on and so forth, okay? So the first point that he made in this speech was that there should be an end to secret diplomacy. Right now, if you remember, this was one of the biggest causes of World War I. Like, the reason why it got so big was because there was all these secret alliances and stuff like that. So he's basically saying that, that should end, that, there shouldn't be any kind of like secret alliances or secret covenants or agreements, right? Because look at what happened. But he also talks about things like freedom of the seas, freedom of trade, a reduction of military weaponry and armaments. He also talks about impartial adjustments of colonial claims. And so the idea behind this is that at the end of this war, there should be a time where, these countries should attempt to sit down and figure out the areas where there are people that are looking to gain independence and autonomy and self-determination, that there should be a sit down, especially in places like the Austro-Hungarian Empire where they need to maybe redraw borders and things like that. And so if you look at, freedom of trade, freedom of the sea, those are 2 points that the United States was arguing, with the whole Lusitania and the unrestricted submarine warfare, that they were saying, hey, look, we are neutral. Like, we're not even like at war with anybody. We have a right to continue trading. We have a right to, access to the seas. And so Wilson is mentioning that in this 14-point speech because he believes that that is a reason why the United States got entangled in this whole mess in the first place. But when he talks about, a reduction of military armaments, remember that militarism is another reason why there's this whole arms race that took place in Europe. And again, part of the reason why so many people are going to lose their lives because of the types of weapons that are being used, right? So anyway, so he's essentially trying to remind people all over the world what the reasons for, these long-term causes of the war were and what we can do to stop that from happening again, okay? So those are, the first 5 points in his 14-point speech. But then he goes on to points 6 and 13, 6 through 13, where, he is talking about specific nations like Poland, Bosnia, Serbia, Romania, Hungary, and their specific borders. And then he gets to point 14, right? The last one on the list. This one to him was the most important one. This is the one that he thought was the key, the League of Nations. He believes that, he wanted a group, an organization where nations could come together and sort of discuss if they have any problems with each other or a dispute, that they should be able to come together. There should be a mechanism. There should be an organization. There should be something so that they could settle the problem, discuss, possible solutions. This is what he believed would be, the peace to end all wars, right? The key. For him, the League of Nations was going to make this possible. And he genuinely wanted to see, that this war would end in peace without victory. But when he arrives in Paris in 1919, right? He arrives there in January 1919. Remember, he gave this speech in January the year before, right? This was a State of the Union address. This is like what he delivered to the American people and, foreign governments who were, listening in. That was his plan, for after the war. When the war is over, right? You got the armistice, November 11, 1918. He arrives in Paris in January 1919 for the peace conference. And so he's got, his 14-point speech, which he believes is going to become the basis for the peace negotiations. Like, he thinks this is going to be the plan. And he believes that because, he's come up with it. He's really sort of fashioning himself as a foreign diplomat. He's come up with this idea of the League of Nations, which he believes is a key to maintain peace. And nobody could tell him otherwise. Okay, so he arrives there in January 1919 with, like dozens of advisors on everything from the economy to the markets and you name it. Okay, rebuilding everything. And when they arrive at the Palace of Versailles, right, which has this like long history, right, goes all the way back to King Louis XIV, he essentially dismisses these advisors, right? He thanks them for accompanying him, but tells them to go home, right? Like, thank you for coming. I won't be needing your services. And they can't believe it. It's like, what do you mean? Like, we're your advisors. We're experts in these fields. And that's the kind of guy that Wilson was, right? He's the guy in the ivory tower, thinks he knows everything, believes he's the smartest guy in the room, that sort of thing. And again, to his detriment, because the other sort of participants that are there at the peace conference, you got... First of all, Russia's not there, right? Because they already signed a peace negotiation with Germany, right? The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So they're not there in the room. You got Germany, who's essentially told to take a back seat, right? Because the Kaiser abdicated. The generals did not negotiate any of the peace or the armistice or anything like that. It's this new German government. And they're in a huge state of flux as well. It's all chaotic and lots of uncertainty surrounding them. So that German delegation is basically told to wait in a room. Right? Like, they're not going to be a part of the negotiations. Austria-Hungary is also told to take a back seat. So who is leading this conference? And so the big three are the United States, Woodrow Wilson, Britain's Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, and France's premier, Georges Clemenceau. Okay, so those are the big three. They're the ones at the head of the table. They are the ones that are essentially, hammering away, forging this peace negotiation and making all kinds of demands. All right. The Italians, even though, at the end of the war, they ended up on the winning side, when they come with their hands out, looking for to claim lands that were a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Vittorio Orlando is going to storm off, pretty pissed off because he's not going to get what he wants. Remember that Italy had imperial ambitions as well. And so they're also told to take a back seat, but nonetheless. One of the things I wanted to mention about this, the relationship and the dynamics between these big three is to give you an idea of how Britain and France sort of felt about Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points. The French premier actually...
I found this on the web.
Oh, no. Actually criticized Woodrow Wilson, saying, who does this guy think he is with his 14 points? God himself only had 10 commandments. And so that kind of gives you a good idea of like how they look at him and, how they feel about him. But more importantly than that is the fact that, Wilson's the guy with the money purse. Okay. He's the one with all the power. In part because, France and Britain owe the United States an incredible amount of money because of the war, right? We've loaned and have let them borrow all kinds of things, and they're in a great amount of debt to the United States. And so France and Britain are really, really, really pushing to see that they get reparations out of this, right? But in order for that to happen, right, how are they going to get anybody to pay for the damages of the war? They have to make somebody take responsibility, okay? And that somebody is going to be Germany. All right, so part of what happens here is Germany is seen as, the biggest threat. Okay. They are, the most industrialized. They are the ones that cause most of the damage. They are the ones that, France and the British have had the biggest problem with. And so they believe that Germany is the biggest threat, and they insist on making Germany take responsibility and admit fault for starting the war. And so they're essentially demanding reparations. They're demanding payment for the damages. Now, before I continue with that, I want to remind you, did Germany start the war? The answer to that is no, right? I mean, who did? Who started the war? Right? It's like, go back. Who started the war? Right? Austria declared war on Serbia because this terrorist organization, the Black Hand, which was sponsored by the Serbian national government, is going to kill the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, right? The Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So, who started the war, right? Was it Serbia? Or was it Austria-Hungary? Well, it was both, right? But in part, Germany's going to get the blame, not only because they're seen as the biggest threat and, they want somebody to pay reparations, but also because when Germany backed up Austria-Hungary, they essentially gave them like a blank check, right? They egged them on. They said, yeah, sure. It's like they encouraged them to continue, right? Which led to all of this triggering of alliances, and, all of the damage that was done was primarily done with the Germans and all of that stuff. Okay, great. So who started the war? Not Germany, right? But they're going to get the blame, in part because they're the biggest threat, in part because, they backed up Austria-Hungary and emboldened them and gave them this blank check, but also because by making Germany pay reparations, right, by making them take responsibility for it, this is going to hinder their progress. This is going to keep Germany down. Okay, that's really kind of like what's going on here. Now, the other sort of factor as well is, why is France and Britain so hell-bent on getting Germany to pay reparations? Well, in part because they owe the United States so much money, right? And Wilson does not forgive any of that debt. I mean, he didn't have to, but when we look at it, from a distance, part of the reason why after World War II, the United States government forgives all of that debt to our allies is because we're trying to prevent the same mistakes from happening again that are going to happen right after World War I. Okay? And so one of the things that I don't like about your book is that it actually says, oh, nobody could have seen this coming, that it was going to bring down the German government and it would start a Great Depression. That's not true, okay? In Margaret Macmillan's book, Paris 1919, it's a doorstopper, right? But I absolutely loved it because it goes into so much detail about the men that are there, about the negotiations, about everything that they're talking about how they feel about each other. And one of the interesting bits about that is how a man by the name of John Maynard Keynes is with the British delegation, and he tries to warn them, right? It's not like a hunch either. This guy is an economist, right? I mean, he's got Keynesian economics is named after him, right? So anybody that's like a business major or whatever, you know what I'm talking about. You know who Keynes is. This is him. He's there. And he's trying to tell them, don't do that. Don't force Germany to pay reparations. They won't be able to. It's going to collapse their economy and every country that's tied to them. And they ignore him. They ignore him. And it has disastrous consequences because that's exactly what's going to happen. Russia is, remember, there's this German, I kept saying Russia, I'm sorry. Germany is going to be forced to pay reparations. I believe it's like, I don't know, $33 billion, which doesn't seem like a lot of money right now, but it was a lot of money back then. But they're basically told, you're responsible for this. By the way, the actual provision in the Treaty of Versailles that makes Germany take responsibility for the war is Article 231, right? It's also known as a war guilt clause. And so they force, this provision on the German government. And if you're wondering, well, why did they sign it? Why did they agree to it if obviously they didn't start the war? Again, there's all of these other factors at play, of which, just to name a few, the whole country is in chaos, right? Remember, the Kaiser has abdicated. The German people don't believe that the war, that they've lost, right? Because all this time they've been told, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. The military, when they come back into the country, like, they don't even look like a defeated military. I mean, they get to like shine their boots and they march back on home. They don't feel defeated. So when they're told that they lost, and there's all of this chaos, there's all this uncertainty because the Kaiser has abdicated. I can't believe that the war has ended. They can't believe that they're on the losing side. And not only that, but there's also a blockade going on, right? Literally like a naval blockade where nothing can get in, nothing can get out, including food. So there's food shortages. There's a lot of insecurity, a lot of instability because of the Kaiser abdicating. But on top of that, right, as if that wasn't enough, there's Bolsheviks, right? There's Russians pouring into Germany, trying to take advantage of this situation, trying to exploit it and incite a Bolshevik revolution right there. So there's like violence on the streets. There's all kinds of, chaos. So when you wonder, why did the German delegation agree to those terms? They're literally like, can we hurry it up here? Like, we've got so many problems to deal with at home that we have to address. Like, you want us to take responsibility? Sure. Okay, we'll pay for the damages. How much is it going to cost? You don't know? You'll get back to us in about 6 months. Okay, sure. I know it sounds insane, but that's how it happened. Again, to put things into perspective, Germany did default on those payments, and we'll get into that later on when we get to the Depression and the beginnings of World War I. But they eventually kept up, their end of the bargain. And I believe it was in 2010 or 2012 when they made the last payment on that reparations bill. Okay? So, took a long time. Let's just leave it at that. Anyways, right? If you're wondering, well, why make Germany take responsibility, right? It's not just all the practical reasons that I mentioned here. Remember, think about it. If you were to get into an accident, right, and it's your fault, right? If it's your fault, you have to do what? You have to pay. And that's kind of the logic behind all of this, right? But it is justified because they want somebody to pay. They want to keep Germany down. They're seen as the biggest threat. They caused the most damage. They egged on Austria-Hungary. Even though they didn't start it, they're going to take responsibility. They're going to force them to do it. And by the way, the war guilt clause is going to become a spot, like a sore spot for the Germans, okay? It's going to be something that is humiliating to them. It's like anytime that you mention the Treaty of Versailles, people are like, it's like the equivalent of like, I'm sorry, but it's like the equivalent of people that say like, but her emails, right? The emails. Same thing, right? You mention the emails and people start foaming at the mouth. Collusion, And speaking of foaming at the mouth, who's the one that you think is going to use these things to get support, to rise to power? It's going to be Hitler, right? Hitler was in World War I. He served. He was actually recovering from a gas attack when he heard of the end of the war. And he couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe it. And it's going to start this whole stab in the back myth. He's going to blame this new democratic German government. And he's going to use the Treaty of Versailles and the humiliation of it, the way that the Germans are treated at the end of it, to get the German people's support to rise to power. And anyways, we'll talk more about that later. I can't wait, by the way. So other provisions of the Treaty of Versailles that I think are worth mentioning is this provision of demilitarization of the Rhineland. Now, the Rhineland it's a region inside of Germany that is going to be demilitarized, like DMZ. Now, why? Okay, well, what's next to Germany, right, on the western border? It's France. France is tired of getting invaded by Germany, and so they want a DMZ. Think of kind of like between North and South Korea. There's an area there where neither side can step in, because then it would alert them that, hey, they're going to attack. Something's, there's movement happening here, and we need to go to war. So after having been invaded again and again by the Germans, at the Treaty of Versailles, that's one of the negotiations, that's one of the provisions that they forced Germany to do, is demilitarize that area inside of Germany, mind you, as a punishment, right, for invading France, and then also as a preventive measure, right, because if Germany steps foot inside of that region, right, militarily speaking, then it's going to alert France that something is coming, and they'll have ample time to respond. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because this is actually one of the provisions that Hitler is going to break as we inch closer and closer to World War II. Okay. Along with the demilitarization of the Rhineland, they also have to reduce their military to like 1,000 combatants. That's it. I mean, it's a ridiculous amount. They have to turn over their navy, which, by the way, they sink. They would rather sink it in the English Channel than hand it over to the British. So, but let's talk about some other things that, and again, that's also going to play a role later on down the line, right? Because again, was the Treaty of Versailles unfair or too tough on Germany? Yeah, it kind of was. And even as, before the ink is dry, as they sign, people are already feeling like, were we too tough? But it's too late. Okay. And the consequences of the peace, are going to be felt down the road. And we're going to talk about that when we get to chapter, I don't know, whatever it is, 23. Let's talk about the League of Nations. This was pretty much like the only of Wilson's 14 points that actually made it onto the Treaty of Versailles, in its entirety. Some other ones, they kind of made it on there, but, they had to negotiate and renegotiate. But the 14th point, right, remember from his 14th point speech, actually did make it onto the Treaty of Versailles. But the problem with this is that by the time Wilson came back to the United States, he's in Paris from January 1919 to June. And this is the first time that a sitting president had ever left the United States for an extended period of time. So it's kind of a big deal. Because even though his League of Nations made it onto the Treaty of Versailles as Article 10, right, known as collective security or the Covenant, by the time Wilson makes it back to the United States, the mood in the country has really shifted. They've already had midterm elections. Wilson, a Democrat, is now having to face all of these Republicans, the Republican opposition. And on top of that, a lot of people in the United States want to go back to isolationism. They want everything to go back to normal. They want to forget this horrible thing that was the war. And this League of Nations thing sounds an awful lot to them like another European entanglement waiting to happen. And so Wilson believes that, even though he believes this is a good idea, this is going to be the key to preserve peace and to prevent another war like this from happening again, he's got a tremendous sales job to do because, the American people just don't want it, right? And even though the president can negotiate treaties, well, he can't just decide by himself, right? Because he needs congressional approval. And so he's facing major opposition here. Henry Cabot Lodge is like his nemesis, right? He's like Magneto to his, Professor X. It's like that way. But he has to essentially, go on this whistle stop tour all over the country, trying to convince Americans, that, to call their congressmen, their senators, and to tell them, we want the Treaty of Versailles, we want to sign it, we want the League of Nations. And maybe because of all the stress, and maybe because just the toll of the war and the pressure of having to convince the American people that we should join the League of Nations, took a toll on him. And he ended up suffering, like a massive stroke that left him kind of like incapacitated for the rest of his term. He gets back to Washington, he suffers this massive stroke. And there were periods, for months at a time when he was not functioning at all. And it was actually his wife and his chief of staff that were, doing all the decisions and essentially taking over for him. So not the vice president. It was Mrs. Wilson, right? So Hillary Clinton, right? Mrs. Wilson was actually, she's deciding which pieces of paper Wilson is looking at, and she does this. She's adamant about it too, because she's doing this for his benefit, for his health. But it's really kind of sad how the debate over the Treaty of Versailles, the debate over the League of Nations, just doesn't go Wilson's way. The American people don't want it. The Senate rejects it. And even though the League of Nations was like Wilson's brainchild, this was his, he conceived of it. This was his, like magnus opus. The U.S. doesn't sign the Treaty of Versailles, even though he was there. Because Congress doesn't approve it. The American people don't want it. And with the United States out of the League of Nations, the organization is essentially crippled from the start. And it will limp on, for a few more years. But eventually in 1933, it dissolves. And the ironic thing about that is that it dissolves right as, Hitler takes over. So at the time when they needed it the most, right, it completely dissolves. Now, if the League of Nations sounds familiar to you, it should, because it's actually the predecessor to the United Nations, right? Which, again, we'll talk about later on in the semester, okay? So, anyways, I think that pretty much does it for us today, and does it for World War I. I'm really hoping that when I click save right now, it will actually save, and I'll be able to upload this to YouTube and post it on Canvas. If not, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to jump from the roof. But all joking aside, I hope that this lecture was helpful. I hope that you learned something, and I hope that I get to see you again next time. Okay? See you later. Bye.